Shortly before 11 in the morning on the 24th of December 1914, an aircraft emerged from low clouds over the English port of Dover. It flew in from the direction of Deal to the north. Aircraft was still a relatively unusual sight in British skies, so people noticed it as it circled and then dove towards them. An eyewitness described hearing a whizzing sound and then, looking up, saw an object falling with smoke following in its trail. A single bomb, the first dropped on England from the air, landed in the garden of one Mr. Thomas Turson, located just 300 metres from the thick old walls of Dover Castle. Windows up to 200 metres away were shattered, and one piece of shrapnel landed at a similar distance on the veranda of a house in Victoria Park. Broken window glass showered the cook working at the local rectory, but she emerged unscathed, as did the gardener, John Banks, who was blown from a tree while cutting evergreen branches for Christmas decorations. But the real damage was to Thomas Turson's garden. A 22-pound high-explosive bomb gouged a crater 9 feet long, 5 feet wide, and 5 feet deep. It completely vaporized the Brussels sprouts that Mr. Turson, an auctioneer, had been diligently growing as the centerpiece for his Christmas dinner. Although this saved Mrs. Turson the trouble of enacting similar culinary destruction on the unsuspecting vegetables, it is the right of all British subjects to endure sprouts on Christmas Day. The two air defense pilots that rose to pursue the raider were unaware of the tragedy that had occurred below. If they had been, then they may have been more determined to find the German. As it was, they evaded their attackers in the clouds. The total damage done in the attack was assessed to be £40. The psychological damage was more enduring. The Christmas Eve attack on Dover was perpetrated by Lieutenant Alfred von Pronsky of the Imperial German Navy. His aircraft was a Friedrichshafen FF-29. The FF-29 is a generally forgotten but actually rather interesting aircraft. Besides destroying the king of vegetables, it was also the cause of a brief but vicious sea battle, scored an unlikely air-to-air kill, and otherwise led a rather interesting but brief career. It was part of a line of lightly armed reconnaissance float planes that served the Imperial Navy throughout the war. The FF-29 was an improved version of the previous FF-19. That aircraft was strongly influenced by the British Avro 501. An example of the 501 had been demonstrated to the Imperial German Navy in 1913, and it so impressed them that they bought the aircraft on the spot. In September of that year, they had the Gotha Company start to build them under license as the WD-1. Flugzeugbau Friedrichshafen saw this aircraft and in short order evolved it into the FF-19. Having previously manufactured pushers, in the FF-19 they moved the engine to the front of a 2-seat, 3-bay biplane. The two forward floats were attached to the fuselage by 4 pairs of V-shaped struts, while the third float was connected directly to the tail structure. It was unarmed, although some small bombs could be stored in the observer's cockpit. The Navy liked the FF-19, which began to arrive in service in May 1914. When the war began in August, 5 were in service. An updated version, designated FF-29, was immediately ordered, capable of carrying a larger payload over greater distances. To this end, a water-cooled 118 horsepower Mercedes D2 straight 6 replaced the FF-19's 99 horsepower D1. Shortages of these engines meant that some of the eventual 32 FF-29s were powered by the 10% heavier but equally powerful Argus AS2. The floats were 2-stepped types, the first 2 sections being flat-bottomed while the portion behind the rear step having a V-bottom. 15 FF-29As were also built by the Wilhelmshaven shipyard with the earlier 100 horsepower engine, presumably because of the shortages that also led to the Argus being used. The first aircraft was delivered in November 1914, just ready for Christmas. Their role was mainly coastal patrol, although they would quite regularly find themselves employed in strikes against targets of opportunity. Following the occupation of the Belgian coast, a seaplane base was established at Zeebrugge in December 1914. Aircraft were kept in the railway station hall at the end of the mole, fully assembled on specially constructed flat railway cars which carried tools, fabric and so on for minor repairs, as well as supplies of water, fuel, and oil. Locomotives were kept with steam up, and they were always available to pull the trains out onto the mole and up to the cranes used to lift and lower the seaplanes into the water. Before the war, a good many attempts were made by German constructors at producing a combined wheel and float undercarriage so that the machines could start from or alight from either land or sea, but that proved harder than it looked, so detachable wheels and tackle were fitted to the floats for running the machine short distances over land. They were left behind when the aircraft got into the water. The occupation of Zeebrugge made it easier to reach Britain's Channel coast. A pair of aircraft moved from Heligoland to take advantage of this. Their first attempt at a bombing attack took place on December the 14th, but although 3 bombs were dropped, no one noticed. The aircraft then suffered an engine problem and had to land in the channel. Unable to take off, the crew had to taxi back to Zeebrugge. Out of fuel, their aircraft drifted ashore in German-controlled Belgium. On December the 21st, Oberlieutenant Pronsky took up the mantle. But his attack also went unnoticed as both of his bombs fell into the sea. Buoyed by his successful brassica interdiction efforts the previous day, though, the GRINCH-like Pronsky returned on Christmas Day. Aided by the foggy conditions, he passed unnoticed until, pursuing a westerly course at 7,000 feet, he flew over Sheerness at about 12:30 p.m. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire without effect. News of the approaching aircraft alerted the Royal Flying Corps airfields at Joyce Green, Farnborough and Brooklands, and the Royal Navy air stations at Eastchurch and Grain. Shortly before 1300, spotters saw the FF-29 again, now flying at about 4,000 feet over Gravesend, then Dartford as it edged closer to London. At 1313, a Vickers FB-4 gun bus intercepted the seaplane over Erith. Combined with the anti-aircraft fire, this persuaded the raiders to turn away from the city. The gun bus had come from Joyce Green, and it was piloted by 2nd Lieutenant Montague Chidson, with a Corporal Martin as his observer and gunner. A chase now developed over Purfleet and Tilbury, as Pronsky began to climb before he turned across the Thames to the Kent side of the river. At about 1335, the German pilot, believing he was over Sheerness, dropped his 2 bombs, claiming he targeted oil storage tanks there, but in fact they had actually landed harmlessly near Cliff Railway Station on the Isle of Grain. Martin, firing a Maxim machine gun, engaged the raider and possibly scored some hits as the Friedrichshafen sustained minor damage. But beyond Sheerness, Chidson and Martin's pursuit came to an end. With the engine running badly and the Maxim jammed, there was little more they could do, so they put down at Eastchurch. A Bristol TB-8 from Dover, flying over Herne Bay, saw the departing raider and attempted to intercept, but could not match its speed and returned to base after a short pursuit. Pronsky and his observer received the Iron Cross for their exploits. On the same day, the Royal Navy mounted a combined air and sea raid on the Zeppelin sheds at Cuxhaven. Seaplane carriers launched aircraft that attempted to bomb the sheds. Having failed to cause significant damage, the raiding force departed. On the way home, the seaplane carrier Empress suffered boiler issues and started to lag behind the force. It was attacked by an FF-19, later by an FF-29 and then a Zeppelin, all of which dropped bombs but failed to hit the moving ship. Despite poor weather in the Channel, the small fleet of FF-29s were very busy in the winter of 1415. And since the aircraft were there, some interesting experimentation took place. Early on the 6th of January 1915, an FF-29A was lashed to the deck of the U-boat U-12 as an experiment to see if the submarine could take the aircraft out into the North Sea, where it could perform reconnaissance duties for the submarine. The machine had to be lashed with the wings parallel to the submarine's length. Despite a fairly heavy sea, the FF-29A was launched successfully about 30 miles out from Zeebrugge. Unfortunately, the conditions deteriorated such that the pilot of the seaplane did not try to make the rendezvous with the submarine, but instead flew back to base. While the idea had worked, it was apparent that much more work would be needed to develop a true integration of a submarine and an aircraft. 3 days later, on the 9th of January 1915, an FF-29 shot down an unarmed Belgian Blériot 11 on a reconnaissance mission over Zeebrugge. The floatplane's observer was armed with a Kar-98 carbine that held only 5 rounds in its magazine, but he fired anyway. Whether he hit the aircraft or not, the Blériot had engine problems over the port and was forced to make an emergency landing. It was then captured intact. The next incident of note that the seaplanes were involved in was the action off the Norhinder Bank on the 1st of May 1915. It all started early on the 1st when two British destroyers, HMS Recruit and HMS Brazen, were patrolling off the Galloper lightship. They were attacked by the coastal U-boat UB-6, which fired torpedoes. At 11:20, Recruit was hit, broke in two, and immediately sank. Four trawlers searching for a U-boat in the area headed out to assist Brazen, which was busy rescuing survivors. At around the same time, a pair of FF-29s were out on a reconnaissance flight around the Thames. One of the aircraft spotted the trawlers, but shortly afterwards, the other one was forced down with a broken crankshaft. The other aircraft also had some mechanical problems. It was suffering with a broken valve spring. So, unable to pick up the other crew, they dropped a message to two large torpedo boats, the SMS A2 and A6 off Zeebrugge. These headed out to destroy the trawlers and rescue the seaplane crew. Upon reaching the scene, they quickly torpedoed and sank the trawler Columbia with only one survivor and began working over the Barbados with gunfire. Eventually, though, return fire from the trawlers forced the torpedo boats to withdraw after one of them had been temporarily stopped. Unfortunately for the Germans, the Harwich force had been informed about the loss of Recruit and dispatched 4 L-class destroyers to hunt for the U-boat. The L-class ships each weighed nearly 10 times as much as the small A-class torpedo boats. They were 10 knots faster and they were far more heavily armed. They ran down and sank both ships. What happened to the pilot and the observer of the FF-29 isn't entirely clear. They'd likely not have been very popular back in Zeebrugge. Only days later, on the 7th of May, the seaplane crews exacted a modicum of revenge on the Royal Navy. The Tribal-class destroyers HMS Maori and HMS Crusader were scouting the Belgian coast between Haste and Blankenberge, laying marks in preparation for a shoot by the battleship Venerable on a misty late spring day. At 3:15 in the afternoon, Maori struck a mine, which detonated under her starboard quarter. She was then engaged by a German shore battery and sank at about 4 in the afternoon, only 2 miles from Zeebrugge. Her crew took to the boats, but the destroyer sank in very shallow water with the yardarm and its flag, still flying, remaining above the water. So FF-29 number 209, piloted by Oberlieutenant Dreckmann, took off and soon landed near the wreck. His observer climbed out onto the float, with, I quote, an open clasp knife between his teeth, pirate fashion. Dreckmann carefully positioned his aircraft in such a way that he could cut loose the ensign. After a hazardous takeoff, they returned to Zeebrugge with their prize. 86 ratings and 7 officers from Maori were captured and became POWs, as did an unfortunate boat crew from Crusader, who were captured after the destroyer was driven off by fire from the shore batteries. Despite reinforcements, by the beginning of December, the detachment had only 2 FF-29s on strength. On the 1st of March 1916, one aircraft was shot down by French patrol boats and came down in the sea near the Middelkerke Bank off the coast of Ostend. This plane was returning after attacking Margate earlier that day, where it killed a 9-month-old baby with a bomb. These were not heroes, but the pilot was rescued by the French nonetheless. The observer drowned. The last FF-29 based at Zeebrugge crashed on the 23rd of May, essentially ending the FF-29 service by virtue of there being no aircraft left. The follow-on FF-33 was larger, more powerful, and built in much greater numbers. It served until the end of the war. But it was the FF-29 that served up the ultimate insult to the British Empire. Christmas in at least one Dover household was cancelled.